Trade is the lifeblood of the galaxy. Its roots, the arteries, its cargo, the pulse that keeps entire worlds alive. Where goods move, power follows, and where power concentrates, institutions rise to try to manage it. The Trade Federation, formerly the Trade Federation of Planets, sometimes called the Galactic Trade Federation, began a few hundred years before the Battle of Yavin as a practical solution. A shipping consortium meant to mediate disputes among freight carriers. Over the following centuries, especially by the 100s in BBY, it shed that narrow purpose. It grew into a sprawling commerce guild and trade cartel, a megacorporation with political reach, and a lobbying force representing an array of business interests, backed crucially by its own vast commercial fleet. With scale came leverage. The Trade Federation extended its control across entire star systems and the major arteries of galactic trade, enforcing its position with a formidable private military and an immense droid army. By the Republic's final decades, its leadership had tilted decisively toward the commercially astute Neimoidians, whose priorities further sharpened its appetite for power. That influence did not go unnoticed. It made the Federation an ideal instrument, useful, pliable, for the Sith Lord, Darth Sidious.
You are listening to the Star Lords Podcast.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
Are you stuck-up, half-witted, scruffy-looking nerf herder?
But I was going into Tashi Station to pick up some power converters.
I got a bad feeling about this.
Origins.
You have to understand what these sectors were like before the Trade Federation arrived. And if it were made to leave, then there'd be no law at all. Quote, Firmus Ket.
The story of the Trade Federation is, at its core, a story about greed and control. Who guides the flow of trade, and who is carried along by it? It began in 350 BBY in the colonies during the Old Republic's Golden Age, as a solution to a practical problem. Chartered by the Republic, the Trade Federation of Planets was meant to mediate disputes among merchants and shipping firms. At the time, massive transport corporations, Pulsar Supertanker, Quasar Cargo, Red Star Shipping Lines, and Aurora Transportation were tightening their grip on commerce, locking rivals out of Outer Rim ports and hoarding vital hyperspace navigation data. The Federation, then a coalition of many species, including the Neimoidians, stepped in to regulate these excesses. But regulation has a way of becoming consolidation. Within a century, the Federation had transformed into a cartel of its own, governed by a directorate led by a viceroy, an executive figure who spoke with the authority of its combined commercial power. From there, its expansion followed the routes it claimed to organize. By leveraging collective bargaining strength, the Federation secured favorable rates and standardized policies, even commissioning Horshek Kessel Drive Inc., a major starship engineering firm, to produce its LH-3210 cargo freighters, vessels that would become the backbone of its shipping empire. By 250 BBY, it had outgrown mediation entirely. It was now lobbied in the Galactic Senate on Coruscant, while pushing outward through the Trade Explorer Corps, an organization dedicated to charting new hyperspace routes. These explorers opened vast stretches of the Outer Rim, remote, underdeveloped regions of the galaxy, to Federation influence, seeding them with depots, landing fields, and supply networks. Yet expansion brought vulnerability. Trade lanes attracted pirates, and planetary security forces were often too corrupt or too weak to respond. So the Federation created the Trade Defense Force, its own paramilitary fleet. Initially tasked with escorting cargo, the TDF quickly became something more, a disciplined and respected force that rivaled official Republic judicial forces. By the late 200s BBY, the Federation appeared to many as the Republic working at its best, diverse, efficient, and capable. It represented its members in the Senate, invested in infrastructure, and secured dangerous trade routes. A frequently cited example comes from the Reseik sector in 214 BBY, a region crippled by piracy and disease following the Bordal contagion, a devastating outbreak that disrupted local economies. Several struggling firms turned to the Federation for help. After negotiations on Syned, an icy outer rim world in the Grumani sector, they became Federation subsidiaries. A Federation fleet, including heavy cruisers and patrol craft, moved in via Sviverin, a key hyperspace junction. When pirates ambushed their first convoy near Tertiary Fujar, the response was overwhelming. The attackers and their asteroid base were destroyed within an hour. Other pirate groups soon followed. Stability returned quickly. Within a decade, the Federation had rebuilt ports on Kurdo III and Laria, established supply hubs like Tyne Albamon, and secured routes across the sector. Ket Shipping, one of the original firms, went from vulnerability to running dozens of convoys annually without a loss. As its influence spread, the Federation tightened its grip. By 150 BBY, trade between the wealthy core worlds and the distant rim was constricting again, this time under Federation dominance. The Senate's response, declaring the Outer Rim a free trade zone in 124 BBY, was meant to encourage open commerce. Instead, it largely removed local taxes on the Federation, giving it even greater freedom to expand. In struggling sectors, deals were struck, economic support in exchange for political loyalty. Some systems effectively traded away their Senate votes. Others became dependent markets, locked into Federation supply chains. Control of hyperspace maps, critical for navigation, remained closely guarded, shared only at a price. Outside the Jedi Order and the Chancellor's office, few possessed comparable data. Even sovereignty became negotiable, with, quote, protectorate agreements signed aboard the Federation's massive core ships, mobile command centers that doubled as symbols of authority. Power in the marketplace soon translated onto power in government. Within 2 generations, the Federation could sway Senate decisions, stall legislation, and influence judicial outcomes. In 67 BBY, it achieved something unprecedented: direct representation in the Senate. Its representative, Lot Dodd, spoke not for a planet, but for a corporation. This shift was not accidental. It was engineered through a deal brokered by Higo Damask II, a financier from Damask Holdings, publicly a businessman, secretly Darth Plagueis, a Sith Lord working behind the scenes to reshape the Republic. In exchange for accepting reforms that slightly reduced its monopoly, the Federation gained political legitimacy. It was a trade, less control over markets, more control over laws. Not all worlds accepted this quietly. On Naboo, a peaceful mid-rim planet, the Federation secured rights to build a spaceport in its capital, Theed, and to export plasma, an extremely valuable energy resource. While profitable for the Federation, many Naboo citizens, including Senator Vidar Kim, saw the deal as exploitative, arguing the resource would be resold at a vastly inflated price. Kim's later assassination by an unidentified gunman only deepened suspicions of how far these economic arrangements reached. Elsewhere, competition and resistance grew. The rediscovered moon of Alaris Prime in the Kashyyyk system became a flashpoint. While Wookiee explorers sought to settle it, the Federation viewed it as a strategic trade hub connecting major routes, including those near Kessel and Bimasari. Back on Coruscant, public opinion fractured. Critics pointed to corruption, coercion, and the erosion of representation in Federation-controlled systems. Others argued that whatever its methods, the Federation delivered results. Its trade defense force had all but eliminated piracy along major hyperspace routes. Opposition took on more practical and violent forms. The Nebula Front, a militant group, declared open resistance. The Stark Commercial Combine, led by the ambitious Iako Stark, attacked Federation convoys and resold stolen goods at steep markups, challenging its dominance through force. Inside the Federation itself, power continued to consolidate. The Neimoidians, drawing on their cultural background of managing vast hierarchical economic systems on worlds like Cato Neimoidia, Deco Neimoidia, and Koru Neimoidia, tightened their control over leadership. Efficient, patient, and ruthless, they refined the Federation's strategies into something more deliberate. By then, the pattern was clear. What had begun as a mediator had become a master of the system it was meant to balance, guiding the flow of trade and, increasingly, the fate of the galaxy itself.
The Stark Hyperspace War. In 44 BBY, it began on the surface as a dispute over Bacta, an essential medical substance used across the galaxy. Amid a growing shortage, the industrialist and pirate Lako Stark began raiding Trade Federation shipments and reselling Bacta at reduced prices. To many in the Outer Rim, long accustomed to scarcity and high costs, he appeared less a criminal than a corrective force. The Federation's response was immediate. It demanded expanded armaments for its merchant fleets, framing the conflict as proof that the trade required stronger protection. Yet, the war itself was no simple clash between pirates and corporations. Behind the scenes, Stark had been working in concert with the Zukfra Corporation, one of the galaxy's primary Bacta producers, and the Federation's own Viceroy, Viceroy Hask. Their aim was not merely to profit, but leverage, to destabilize supply, undermine the Republic's military readiness, and seize economic dominance. Central to the plan was a nav computer virus, capable of crippling entire fleets by corrupting their navigation systems. In the Senate, the crisis exposed deeper fractures. Finis Valorum called for a peace conference, seeking to address the war's underlying causes through negotiations. But others saw the situation differently. Ranulf Tarkin, a proponent of decisive force, uncovered hints of the conspiracy and forced Nute Gunray to reveal the location of the talks on Troikin. Tarkin moved quickly, assembling a fleet to strike Stark's forces before diplomacy could take hold. But the trap was already set. The nav computer virus tore through his ships, leaving his fleet shattered before it could engage. Forced onto the surface of Troikin, Tarkin's forces became embroiled in a grinding ground conflict as the war escalated beyond its original scope. The Jedi Task Force uncovered the hidden coordination between Zukfra and the Trade Federation. On Coruscant, Jedi Master Mace Windu used this evidence to pressure Hask and Gunray into releasing Trade Defense Force assets for a counteroffensive. Faced with exposure, the conspiracy began to fracture. Stark himself defected, offering intelligence to the Republic in exchange for amnesty. The war ended soon after, but its resolution brought little stability. Hask resigned in disgrace, and Gunray rose to replace him as Viceroy, an ascent that would shape the Federation's next chapter. Far from retreating, the Federation doubled down, intensifying its demands for heavier armament and greater autonomy in defending its interests. What had changed was not leadership, but perspective. The Senate had seen how easily commerce could be turned into conflict. The Federation had seen how crisis could justify expansion. And both sides, in different ways, had moved closer to confrontation. Behind it all, another hand had been guiding events. Darth Sidious, publicly known as Palpatine, and secretly the apprentice to Darth Plagueis, had orchestrated the crisis. by inflaming tensions between the core worlds and the Outer Rim, and by drawing both the Trade Federation and its opponents into escalating cycles of mistrust and force. Sidious advanced a larger design. Under new management.
Power, once concentrated, rarely loosens its grip. Over the decade following the Stark Hyperspace War, the Trade Federation's internal balance shifted from coalition to central control. At the center of that shift was the growing influence of the Neimoidian Inner Circle, an elite governing body tied to the wealthy Neimoidian purse worlds, whose economies revolved around vast, tightly managed financial systems. The Inner Circle was closely linked to the Trade Federation itself. When the Federation's viceroy was Neimoidian, he also stood as the Circle's leader, binding corporate authority to cultural hierarchy. Formally, the Federation was still governed by a 7-member directorate, also called the Executive Board, responsible for overseeing its immense commercial assets. This body selected its own members and appointed key leadership roles, including the Viceroy, Deputy Viceroy, and Senate Representative. Its decisions, however, were increasingly shaped behind closed doors, particularly during exclusive gatherings on the Sojourn Moon, where influence flowed as freely as credits. By the mid-30s BBY, that influence had become dominance. The Directorate still appeared diverse on paper, comprising representatives from multiple species and worlds, but real authority was consolidating around a single figure, Nute Gunray. Around him formed an informal but powerful inner circle of loyalists, including Hath Monkar, Lot Dodd, and Rune Hako. Though not all were Directorate members, they operated as extensions of Gunray's will, reinforcing his authority while advancing their own positions. At the same time, the Federation was preparing for something far beyond commerce. In secret, it began assembling a vast droid army, an industrial-scale military force that would allow it to enforce its interests without reliance on Republic institutions. To avoid scrutiny, shipments of battle droids and military hardware were disguised as advanced binary load lifters, a plausible cover that allowed them to pass through Republic customs with minimal inspection. Meanwhile, tensions in the Senate continued to rise. As the Federation's dominance grew, so too did calls to abolish the Outer Rim free trade zones and reimpose taxation. Such measures threatened the very foundation of the Federation's power. Through procedural delays and relentless filibustering, led by Lot Dodd, these efforts were stalled again and again, buying time as the Federation strengthened itself behind the scenes. The breaking point came in 33 BBY at the Iradu Trade Summit, a high-level gathering intended to address growing unrest over trade and taxation. What should have been a forum for negotiations instead became an execution. Security droids supplied to Gunray through channels controlled by Darth Sidious, quote, malfunctioned, killing all non-Neimoidian members of the Directorate. The attack was widely blamed on the Nebula Front, the military anti-Federation group already known for its opposition. Even the Jedi and the Front itself accepted this explanation, unaware of the deeper orchestration. In truth, the massacre eliminated the last internal checks on Neimoidian control. In the aftermath, Gunray stood alone at the top of the Federation. With the Directorate effectively purged, he moved quickly to consolidate power, replacing the fallen members with loyal Neimoidian aides. Figures like Hako, Dodd, and the starship captain Dualte Dauphine rose to positions of greater influence. The transformation was complete. What had once been a multi-species consortium was now, in practice, a Neimoidian monopoly, directed by a single will, one increasingly aligned with Sidious's designs. With no internal opposition and a hidden army at its disposal, Gunray now possessed both the authority and the means to act. The next step would not be negotiation, it would be invasion.
Escalation. If the Federation's rise had been written in contracts and corridors of power, its overreach was exposed far from Coruscant, in the contested wilds of Alaris Prime. After 2 decades of legal dispute, the Galactic Senate awarded colonization rights on Alaris Prime, a resource-rich moon in the Kashyyyk system, to the Wookiees. The Trade Federation ignored the ruling. Sometime between 39 and 36 BBY, it deployed elements of its secret droid army to establish an illegal colony, turning the moon into a covert industrial foothold. At first, the operation seemed secure, but Alaris Prime was not empty. Its native predators, Gundarks, large and aggressive beasts, attacked a Federation power core, forcing the abandonment of one installation. When Wookiee scouts arrived soon after, two of them, Chewbacca and Shoran, discovered and destroyed the damaged facility. They did so under the guidance of a Jedi, Qui-Gon Jinn, who, sensing something amiss, questioned why advanced technology had appeared on a supposedly uncolonized world. The Federation's response revealed its mindset. Nute Gunray dispatched a battle droid unit, led by the B-1 series commander, OOL-2, to investigate. Then told the damage had been caused by Gundarks, Gunray ordered their extermination, and even arranged for their pelts to be delivered to a Trandoshan ally, Pect, reflecting the Federation's transactional approach to both allies and ecosystems. But the operation quickly escalated. As battle droids moved to wipe out the Gundark nests, they encountered Wookiee forces already engaged in the same region. The encounter turned violent. The Wookiees destroyed the droids, marking the beginning of open conflict. From that moment, the Wookiee colonists, led by their chieftain Atachikuk, shifted their priorities to dislodge the unwelcome invaders. The fighting that followed was not a single battle, but a series of localized clashes. Federation probe units, such as those commanded by the droid DRN-38, struck at Wookiee patrols, even wounding Atachikuk in an ambush. Believed dead, his survival was sensed through the Force by Qui-Gon Jinn, prompting Chewbacca to lead a rescue mission deep into Federation-held territory. The conflict quickly settled into a pattern. Battle droids deployed in force and destroyed just as decisively. Even advanced units, droidekas, heavily shielded destroyer droids, failed to turn the tide. After Atachikuk was recovered, Chewbacca assumed a greater leadership role, organizing counterattacks that struck at the Federation's infrastructure, including a droid production outpost overseen by another command unit, GWC-04. The Federation escalated again, deploying experimental battle droid variants and specialized units, like beetle droids, in an attempt to overwhelm Wookiee positions. These too were repelled. When Wookiee scouts uncovered hidden listening array used by the Federation to monitor and predict their movements, it was destroyed, binding the occupying forces. At that point, the conflict reached its inevitable conclusion. Chewbacca and the Wookiees resolved not merely to resist, but to remove the Federation entirely. Their final target was a fortified base commanded by the droid SRAM-13, the last major Federation stronghold on Alaris Prime. The assault combined ingenuity with force, using Agar starfighters and heavy energy weapons. The Wookiees disabled the base's defenses before launching a full ground assault. Among the fighters were Chewbacca, the recovered Atachikuk, Shoran, and, at last in person, Qui-Gon Jinn, who had until then guided events from afar. The resulting battle for Alaris Prime ended with the destruction of the Federation's fortress and the collapse of its illegal colony. It was a decisive victory. In the aftermath, something more significant came to light. The conflict exposed the Federation's hidden manufacturing operations on the moon, proof that its military buildup was not defensive, but deliberate, and would likely be used again for further acts of aggression. The machinery of trade had become the machinery of war. Revelation.
By 33 BBY, the pattern that had been building for decades, consolidation, crisis, and control, gave way to something more direct. The guiding hand behind it all, at long last, stepped out of the shadows. Darth Sidious revealed himself to the Neimoidian leadership of the Trade Federation, no longer a distant influence, but as a direct partner. To Nute Gunray, this, quote, partnership was both coercion and opportunity. Sidious exploited Gunray's frustration with the Directorate, his belief that his abilities were undervalued and his ambitions constrained, while promising advancement and greater personal authority. It was a careful balance of pressure and praise designed to secure loyalty without resistance. To cement that loyalty, Sidious moved to strengthen Gunray's position materially. He dispatched his apprentice, Darth Maul, to the mining world of Devola, a planet rich in iomite, a valuable mineral used in starship hull production. There, Maul manipulated tensions between two rival corporations, Lomite Limited and Intergalactic Ore, driving them into conflict before forcing a merger into Dorvola Mining. The result was a precisely engineered, a unified entity that granted the Trade Federation export rights over Lomite and accepted its representation in the Senate. With that, Gunray's influence expanded, and so did Sidious's hold over him. At the same time, unrest continued to simmer. The Nebula Front escalated its terrorist attacks. Sidious turned even this instability to his advantage. In a calculated move, he instructed Gunray to sacrifice one of the Federation's own Lurshik-class freighters, the Revenue, along with a cargo of Erodium worth billions. When the vessel was subsequently raided by Nebula Front operatives led by Arwen Cole, it appeared to confirm the Federation's claim of vulnerability. Gunray responded predictably, renewing demands for heavier armament and expanded defensive authority. Each crisis, carefully shaped, justified the next step. In the Senate, Sidious played a different role. Publicly as Palpatine, he advised Finis Valorum that renewed taxation of the Outer Rim was necessary to curb the excesses fueling unrest. Such taxation would dismantle the free trade zones, the very foundation of the Federation's wealth. Predictably, resistance followed. Lot Dodd once again blocked proceedings, arguing instead for expanded military protections. The debate deadlocked, just as Sidious intended. To resolve the impasse, Palpatine proposed a summit on Iradu, a neutral ground where all parties might negotiate. But like so many preceding events, the outcome had already been arranged. At the summit, security droids, again manipulated through Sidious's influence, turned on the Trade Federation Directorate. The massacre left only Gunray and Dodd alive, eliminating the last internal opposition to Neimoidian control. The aftermath was swift. Gunray filled the vacant Directorate seats with loyal Neimoidian allies, many of whom would later form the Occupation Council during the coming Naboo crisis. The Senate, meanwhile, hardened its stance. Outrage over the Iradu disaster and the Federation's conduct led to renewed determination to impose taxation, formalized in Senate Resolution BR 0371. Among its supporters was Padme Amidala, the newly crowned monarch of Naboo, who called for reform. Palpatine publicly supported her position, while privately ensuring it would provoke the exact reaction he required. As Sidious, he contacted Gunray one final time, urging him to act. The directive was clear: prepare a blockade of Naboo in protest. It was the last move needed to set the board. The Trade Federation, once an arbiter of trade, now stood ready to ignite a crisis that would reach far beyond commerce, one that would begin on a single world and end with the fall of the Republic.
Now a word from our sponsors.
Did your last Republic tax filing feel slightly illegal, even though it probably wasn't? Introducing Corellian and Associates Interstellar Tax Service. Because nobody reads galactic tax law, not even the people who wrote it. Ever tried filing deductions for hyperspace fuel, then accidentally declared your astromech as a dependent and a capital asset? Yeah, we fixed that. Back taxes? We've seen worse. Audit coming? We'll represent you. Lost receipts? Honestly, at this point, who hasn't? Think of us like a Jedi mind trick, but for paperwork. We cannot influence auditing officers, but we can make your ledger look like you've never met them. And if you act now, we'll even throw in a complimentary pre-audit review, because nothing says peace of mind like discovering your financial mistakes before the Republic does. Corellian and Associates. We handle the credits so you don't end up explaining them in a Senate subcommittee hearing. Welcome aboard the Millennial Falcon. This is Christian.
And this is Jordan.
And we're just currently on the beautiful world of Cato Neimoidia, admiring the big hanging cities. Just about to file our space taxes. I'm
just reading, economics textbooks.
All the reasons why you shouldn't pay your space taxes. Yeah.
The mechanisms of, supply and demand and all that good stuff. But there's also other mechanisms of supporting this show and keeping this bucket of bolts in the air. If you want to support the show, make sure you head on over to patreon.com/starlords and you can become a Patreon member. For $3 a month, you can get access to all the bonus content as well as ad-free episodes. We also accept payments via PayPal or Bitcoin, and you can find those links all in the description of this episode. Also, don't forget to rate and review the show. If you can't support it monetarily, not a problem at all. Just another way that is a big help for us to help support the show is just rating and reviewing the show. Also, make sure to reach out to us on social media. We are on Instagram, Facebook, X. We're also on Discord. And if you have any fan fiction collections, you can send them on there or email us at starlorspodcast@gmail.com. And we'd love to hear from you. I'll swing it back to you there, Christian.
Yeah. Well, we did briefly discuss Trade Federation in a previous episode. We did look at galactic corporatism as a whole and kind of did a very high-level review of like a lot of the big names you might know and love, like the banking clans and, of course, the Trade Federation. But this episode is obviously dedicated more so to as a deep dive on the history and origins and kind of like what they do. Truthfully, there's not a whole lot to the depth of them. They're a cool institution. I think they're a cool organization for the universe that they inhabit. But compared to some of the detailed histories we have for a lot of other organizations and companies, I was actually surprised at how little we have on the Trade Federation. Actually, how new they are on the scale of things. A lot of galactic companies are a lot older.
Okay.
And the Trade Federation is only really a few hundred years old, and even underwent a lot of change in that couple hundred years. So yeah, just kind of some interesting observations. Let's talk about free trade as a whole.
Yeah, you definitely see in the Trade Federation sort of Lucas's worldview or
biases.
You might call them. It seems to be very much, especially obviously in episode 1, it's really painting a picture that trade is bad.
Free trade is bad, guys.
Free trade.
Taxes is good.
Yeah. Taxes and regulation are great, and free trade and it is bad. But what say you, Christian?
I say,
is he inserting too much of his own beliefs into the story, or is this just something we should just take for granted? And obviously,
I think obviously a lot of that is toned down in the film itself.
Yeah.
A lot of people glaze over at the word taxes in a Star Wars movie.
Yeah.
So I've heard. I don't think he's that explicit about those stances. He's just saying this is an issue that the galaxy is dealing with, and it's more in like the back story and history and stuff about the fiction that where the bias really comes out. So I do appreciate that it's not like slaps you in the face in the movie where like Darth Maul openly states that free trade is a Sith ideology or anything like that. Kind of like how Disney tends to do nowadays, but
Yeah.
it's a little less heavy-handed in the films, at least, is what I'll say. As wrong as he is about economics.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of history and interesting history, even if you kind of want to look at things a little more objectively. The idea of a conglomerate that either becomes powerful enough to rival a government, or the reverse of that, a corporation that becomes embedded so deeply with the government that the difference is negligible.
Right.
I think both of which are situations that have occurred in the past, if not do occur regularly, much to the chagrin of many political analysts and commentators.
There's also, there was a lot happening in George Lucas's time that when the original Star Wars came out, I think the first one, 77, that was kind of when it came out. So you're like 2 years after the Vietnam War ends.
Yeah.
It's very much in that arena. There's also another thing happening that maybe is a little underappreciated, but the 70s was like a real time of economic malaise in America. And you had like the Arab oil shock, you had stagflation, high unemployment, but inflation was also very high too. And it was kind of a rough time in the 70s and the war, right? And the aftermath of
cocaine
the war.
and disco to take the edge off.
Yeah. Sort of like, I think going out of, if you go to the post-war period from like 1945, like the late 40s, let's call it, right up into the mid 60s, it was just like a boom period. It like so much new technology,
growth.
Things were just like going really well. Yeah, and then all of a sudden, just everything just grinds to a halt in the 70s, and I think there is a lot of depression, a lot of cynicism about life. There's kind of like that outlook, and in a lot of ways, I feel like it feels similar to the 1970s, like
today,
even today.
Yeah. Today being not to totally date this episode, but being in the 2020s.
Exactly. In the 2020s, there is sort of that. I just a general dissatisfaction among most people, even if they have it relatively good.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, the parallels are definitely there. It's also on the back end of like a long unpopular war, and like there's a lot of parallels between the 70s. Yeah,
high inflation, low economic growth, job prospects are kind of not ideal.
Yeah,
there's some. All
the blockading of specific trade routes being somewhat important to geopolitics.
Yeah. I mean, even in the 70s, the Middle East featured very important in the 70s, right?
Yeah.
Like just as it does now.
Yeah. Oil trade.
Yeah.
And again, like even historically speaking, like the idea of controlling trade routes and it being like this big geopolitical tool, either to restrict your enemies or to prevent any number of like economic outcomes that you want to try to mitigate, is a real strategy that has occurred more than once. And like controlling these narrow, like we've mentioned before, the importance of naval shipping from a military context, but also from a trade context. Is like
majorly important.
Yeah, and it is the lifeblood of empires. And to control like any kind of narrow straits or anything like that strategically is vitally important. Because it's a choke point. It is an artery. It keeps global trade moving. And to create a blockade or even an accidental one causes like huge problems in the world of finance and commerce.
Yeah. And again, like going back to the 70s, there was like a lot of interesting things that was happening. It's just interesting that the Trade Federation, the way that they're depicted, this was the era when really globalization started to go into overdrive. And one of the reasons for that was actually the U.S. going off of the gold standard. And this was going to cause a lot of inflation. And what had happened is the U.S. was basically the manufacturing superpower.
Yeah, especially like you said, after the war, right?
Yeah.
They had all this wartime infrastructure to build war material.
Absolutely.
Now just converted to civilian use, which provided a lot of jobs and a lot of financial growth. But now you're offshoring.
Yeah, but when they went off the gold standard, they knew that inflation was going to become a problem. And I think the economists in the Nixon administration, when this happened, knew that inflation was going to be a major problem. So they were going to have to offshore that, because otherwise cars are going to, go from, 6 months of income to 10 years of income very quickly, right?
Weird how that happens.
Yeah, it is weird how that happens, right? So they desperately needed to get like cheap labor so that the U.S. consumer could still afford to buy these goods.
Right.
And that really was the strategy behind offshoring. And I will say, from my perspective, even though, yes, there was a lot of pain from that and it sucked, since they did go off the gold standard, it was absolutely necessary. You would have completely collapsed the U.S. economy if you did not offshore. You would have just had like total hyperinflation. I don't think they could have survived it by going off. Simply just by going off. Had they stayed on the gold standard, they could have kept manufacturing in America. But because of that choice to go off the gold standard, I think it made it kind of an impossible situation where, I think it was June 1971, Nixon closes the gold window, and then something like January, February, maybe March of 1972, Nixon goes and meets with Mao Zedong for the first time to open up normalized relations with China, which is also kind of funny because they were trapped in this war in Vietnam,
Cold War in Vietnam, and
to fight communism, and then all of a sudden
giving them their jobs.
They're making like a deal with like one of the worst communists in history, right? But I like to always remind people, all states put self-interest ahead of principle, so it's always good to remember that at the end of the day. This is kind of just an overview of what happens, and just setting up context perhaps for like what Lucas himself was thinking and what he actually lived through. Yeah. And maybe was kind of the inspiration to some of these things. So anyways, then all of a sudden you have the US, it has to seek elsewhere around the globe in order to keep its consumer economy alive. And so you have free trade. You have things like NAFTA. Well, NAFTA comes later, but the
same ideas back, those kinds of agreements.
Yeah, that's where it starts, is sort of like the 70s and the closing of the gold window, and then they're sort of forced to globalize and open up their markets a lot more to the rest of the world.
Yeah. And further to that, like obviously Lucas having his left-wing bent at the time, a lot of left-wing labor movements would have been opposed to the offshoring of local jobs, right?
Oh yeah.
So definitely you could see how that's linked.
Yeah. And it kind of shows you how like political winds change, and like the sort of arbitrary spectrum always changes, because back then a lot of left-wingers, and even someone like a Bernie Sanders, if you go back in time long enough, he was pretty anti-immigration. Yeah. Which like you don't think about in the modern Democratic Party, that they're anti-immigration, but that typically was the sort of leftist position to
Yeah.
protect labor, right?
Yeah.
Because the most important thing is labor, and having people compete for,
jobs.
downbid the job market is always bad for labor. And even in our country of Canada, you have like the NDP party, which back in the day used to be very anti-immigration as well, and now they're very
much
pro
pro-immigration.
very pro-immigration. And now it's more like people on the right who are more anti-immigration and kind of pro-labor in that sense, right? Like,
you got to protect local jobs,
more
and
protectionist,
local industry. Yeah.
And I'm not making an opinion or comment on that. I'm just an
observation.
Yeah, an observation about it.
Certainly. Yeah. It is funny too, the China
I was going to say that too.
parallel with the Trade Federation that's often brought up as well.
Yeah, they're Chinese coded. That's been the accusation anyway. Yeah.
But it does make sense though if you look at the historical context that Lucas is writing from. It's like, oh, actually that is a parallel.
That is what happened. Yeah.
Which is hilarious. But yeah, suddenly I love all the memes that have been coming out since again, not to date this episode too badly, but the closing of the Strait of Hormuz and just the memes of Lucas like, I told you taxes and trade routes are important, and it's just lots of memes going around right now vindicating Lucas's authorships of episode 1. So,
yeah. I mean, trade routes are such an important part of like so many wars. I think about the Gallipoli campaign in World War I and the Allies' attempt to close the Dardanelles, which was controlled by the Ottoman Empire at the time.
And even before that, like the Dardanelles are super important, not just through World War I, but even through like
for centuries. It's always been super important. But it was like sort of a choke point where if you can shut down this very small strip of water, you can like basically
affect geopolitics,
collapse like the Ottomans empire, right? And ultimately, it did collapse, but the Gallipoli campaign was
not the reason.
was kind of a disaster if you read about the history. But
and another thing, again, going back to the historical parallels, even the idea of crown corporations, right? Like and imperialism, especially during the colonial era. You have things like the Hudson's Bay Company, the Northwest Trading Company, the East India Company, like all these companies that were very much embedded with their governments at the time, pretty much given free reign over the lands that they were transacting in, right? Like the British Empire would go to an area of land, claim it for their own, and then they would kind of like outsource its management to a private company. And these companies, again, people who aren't, it's 50-50 whether people are familiar with the concept of a crown corporation, but it's a corporate entity pretty much controlled by a government, hence the title crown. They still exist, even like Jordan said earlier with Canada and Canada's context. A lot of our companies that are controlled by the federal government are also considered crown corporations. They're still
like our railways, our crown corporations. There's something called the Hudson Bay Company, which is pretty embedded in our own history, with the fur trade, especially early on.
Exactly.
Yeah,
there are a lot of horror stories too around that, and a lot of these crown corporations pretty much acted as a government because they were the
they're
institutional arm.
They're sort of this weird quasi-private, yet still owned by the government or the state. But they have a lot more autonomy than a typical state would. But they're also a lot more efficient than a typical government department
on
or
the
ministry.
Profit motive.
Yeah, exactly.
But even that, though, will eventually, look at how our current crown corporations are run. Eventually, it all goes back to...
and I would say even like America kind of has its own version of crown corporations, if you will. Like
anyone embedded with the military-industrial complex?
But I mean, you think about like even a company like Boeing.
I was going to say Lockheed Martin.
I would say even more Boeing, simply because Boeing is in so many countries. But it is like completely backstopped, and there's like a revolving door between the U.S. government and Boeing.
Like their board of directors and their government positions.
Exactly. And like Boeing will never be allowed to fail because it has too many government secrets. But Boeing also operates in all these other countries. So it sort of does behave on the behest of the American government.
Certainly.
Right?
Yeah. No, it's
it's
actually
kind of like an American version of a crown
corporation.
corporation.
Yeah. Even if not on officially on paper.
Yeah, exactly.
No, that's certainly not a bad observation. But going back to the older version of crown corporations, they could hire their own soldiers. They had their own militaries. They had because they were like, in the Americas, they're fighting off indigenous groups or fighting off other corporations too.
Mm-hmm.
So they had a lot of authority and power. There's lots of horror stories too about
there is,
especially in Africa. The operation was a lot of these crown corporations. And also, even like the indentured servitude of their own employees. Oftentimes, they were paid, not even paid with money, but with company script.
Right.
And so, like, they completely controlled you. They owned you. You were essentially a slave, even though you were an employee.
Yeah.
And what they did to local populations and things. It's just a huge
I believe
of,
even in Canada, it's sort of like a novelty item you can find, but you can find like Hudson Bay Company notes, which was like money, but
because they were the only store,
but they're the only ones who would trade in it, right? So you couldn't go to anyone else, and
you couldn't become
trade with it.
Independently wealthy because you're getting paid in what not the government, the local company allows you to have, and then they would also do things like pre-charge you, right? So like, actually, we gave you your boots, your uniform, and all that.
That's right.
So we're gonna auto deduct that from your pay. So you actually owe us for working for us, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's even sorry, not to go on too much of a tangent, but if someone wanted to go on their own little historical exploration, if you look at the coal mining companies in the Appalachian Mountains in the 1800s, had these very similar practices too. And they were very exploitative. And a lot of the people who lived in the Appalachian Mountains were completely illiterate. So they were like signing contracts that they had no idea what they
were signing away.
And so like,
aren't there other groups of people that signed contracts that didn't know?
What do you mean?
Nothing.
Okay.
I was making a joke.
Okay. But this has been like I don't know how widespread that practice still is. I'm sure it exists in some form or another now today. But this is sort of like how private interests will act sort of on behalf of a government, right? Yeah. And like what was happening in the Appalachians, it was like actually mostly because the government of Virginia wanted the land basically, and they wanted to kick out these illiterate rednecks, and they were using private mining companies to do it. Stuff like that.
A lot of these companies end up acting as the de facto government, being the only representation present, right? So like they're the ones negotiating. Again, same thing with indigenous groups, right? Like they're the ones actually on the front line speaking with them. You have their trappers and things, or their negotiators. So they're company men that are actually going out to speak on behalf of the crown with local indigenous groups or enslave and or murder and or the long litany of horrific historical incidences.
But all of this to say is like why I even at the very least I appreciate the introduction of the Trade Federation into the Star Wars story. Just because it's believable to me. It's like believable that something like this, maybe the way they are presented is a little cartoonish, but it is like believable that something like this would exist, right?
Yeah, and it does make sense too in the context of the universe of like they started out as with good intentions, and then they became the thing that they were allegedly created to stop, and that happens so often with big institutions. They became a cartel essentially, and that's bad. The reason that people criticize governments is they become a monopoly,
right?
And it's not doesn't lead towards good outcomes in a lot of cases.
Fun, the Trade Federation. What do you guys think?
Oh,
Pro or against? Let us know.
I always thought it was kind of cool to have like a dystopian sci-fi future where Walmart had like a private army.
Yeah.
And they were like having running gun battles with whatever their next biggest competitor, grocery chain. Or
I mean, I feel like Tesla is on the verge of having its own robot army, like literally
becoming the trade federation.
They're also like very involved in
With
the
the
US,
government.
US
Yeah.
government. So it's not totally out of the question.
George Lucas is just sitting on his throne of I told you so.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So, but I think that's all I got. Anything else from you, Christian?
No. In concept, I really like the historical allusions and everything with the Trade Federation, and I think they're a cool faction.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, with that, make sure to go rate and review the show. If you want to support us again, we're on patreon.com/StarLords. And don't forget to reach out to us on social media, Facebook, X, Instagram, and we're on Discord. All links will be in the description. We'll see you guys next time.